Peace be upon you, and welcome to My Story. I am a girl, and I am currently 18 years old. My story starts from my childhood when I was just 7 years old and entered the first grade at a school that, unfortunately, became the source of my misery. The teachers were incredibly harsh with me, and it wasn't really because of anything I did. The reason was simple. My parents believed every complaint that came from the teachers. Every time there was an issue, no matter how small, my parents would take the teacher's side without even asking me for my side of the story or understanding what actually happened. My father, especially, would come to school and hit me in front of the teachers for any reason, even over things that had no real significance. For instance, if I had an argument with another student, or if a teacher accused me of cheating on a test, my father would punish me without hearing my side. Despite all of this, I was always one of the top students at school, achieving very high grades. I loved school at first, but when I reached the third grade, I started to hate studying. It wasn't because I suddenly disliked learning, but because I felt forced to study under the pressure from my parents. If I lost just one mark on a test, my mother would make me feel like a failure. She would constantly compare me to my cousins, especially since they were in the same school. She would say things like, "Look at your cousin. She got higher marks than you in this subject. Why aren't you like her?" These constant comparisons made me hate everything about school and even about my life at home. At home, my life was a different kind of struggle. Every day after coming home from school, I was only allowed to study. I wasn't allowed to do anything else. No playing, no going out, nothing. My parents would go out without me, leaving me alone at home. They deprived me of socializing, of going on family outings. I was the eldest, and I had a younger brother who was just a year younger than me. While my brother was treated differently, I would sit at home and try to distract myself with drawing or making crafts after I finished studying. I had a computer, but I wasn't allowed to use it much. My mother would use it, and my brother had more access to it than I did. Whenever I got a turn, my mother would let me stay on it for only a short while before making me get off. And then there was the constant physical punishment. My parents, especially my mother, would hit me for the smallest reasons. If I didn't wash the dishes, she would hit me. If I forgot to fold the laundry or didn't put the clothes in the dryer, she would hit me. Even if she found me awake at night, she would beat me until she was exhausted and would then leave the room, while I would stay there crying until I fell asleep. My father wasn't much different. He was like a robot, always following my mother's lead. I'm sorry if it sounds harsh to talk about them this way, but I went through so much pain. My father adored my mother so much that he would do anything she asked, even if it was harmful to me. If my mother told him to hit me, he would do it without hesitation. He would never question her decisions, and she would fill his head with things about me. She would constantly tell him, "Look at what your daughter did. Look at how she disrespected me. Go hit her. What are you waiting for?" He would do exactly what she told him, like he was under her control. As for the phone, I never had one because my parents didn't want me to get distracted from my studies. Meanwhile, my brother had a phone, and that made me feel a deep sense of unfairness. Our environment was quite judgmental. We lived in a place where the way you dressed defined you. Some girls wore revealing clothes, others swore and used bad language, while others wore modest clothing or covered themselves fully. I, myself, wore modest clothing, but was not fully veiled. Despite that, I always felt proud of the way I dressed and hoped to improve myself more in the future. As I mentioned, my brother had privileges that I didn't. He had a phone, I didn't. When the family went out for fun, they would take him and leave me behind. My parents put so much pressure on me when it came to my studies, but not on him. He could visit our grandparents' house whenever he wanted, while I couldn't. This sense of inequality between us only added to my feelings of resentment. Emotionally, I didn't really have feelings for anyone during those early years. I didn't like anyone, nor did I have any crushes in elementary school. But I always imagined growing up and getting married as a way to escape from my parents, especially my mother. I remember in the morning assembly at school, the principal would often count how many years were left until we went to university. But in my head, I would always count the years until I could leave my home and get married. In the 6th grade, I would think to myself, just 6 more years until I'm done with high school, and then I can finally get married and leave this place. It became my secret goal, to get through school and escape the harsh treatment at home. When I moved to middle school, things changed for me. I started to become more rebellious and aggressive. I would start arguments and fights with other students. I didn't want anyone to sit next to me in class, and I always made sure to sit alone at the last table. I avoided socializing at all costs. I didn't attend weddings or gatherings. I avoided anything that involved large groups of people. In middle school, my behavior got worse. I started to engage in forbidden relationships. I began talking to boys, even though I didn't have a phone. A girl from school had set up an Instagram account for me using the computer at home. I didn't really understand social media, but I started browsing, adding people, both boys and girls, without much thought. I posted my drawings and soon began getting requests for paid commissions. This became my secret side job. I would draw for people, sell the drawings, and make money without my parents knowing. One day, a guy messaged me, asking for a portrait. At first, I refused because I only drew for girls, but he insisted. He told me he would have his sister contact me instead, so it wouldn't seem inappropriate. Reluctantly, I agreed and finished the drawing. I asked a younger cousin to deliver it to him on my behalf. This arrangement worked, and the guy was really happy with the drawing. A few days later, a girl messaged me saying she wanted a drawing of herself and her husband. After some chatting, I realized she was the sister of the guy I had drawn earlier. We became friends, even though she was 6 years older than me and married. We grew close, and 6 months later, she told me something shocking. Her brother had developed feelings for me. He had fallen in love with me from afar, based on my drawings and our brief conversations. He wanted to propose to me. I was only in middle school at the time. The idea of marriage seemed far away, and I knew my parents wouldn't approve. But I gave the girl my parents' contact information, and she convinced her mother to call mine. The next day, her mother called my mom and asked for my hand in marriage for her son. My mom was polite but declined, saying that I was too young and needed to finish high school first. When the call ended, my father called me in and asked, "Did someone see you at a wedding and wants to marry you?" I didn't know what to say, so I lied and said no. But then my mom slapped me hard across the face, though I hadn't done anything wrong. She accused me of bringing this boy into our lives, and even though I hadn't, I couldn't argue. She began searching through my things, trying to find evidence of a relationship. When she couldn't find anything, she broke my computer into pieces. After my mom destroyed my computer, she stormed out of the room, leaving me in shock. That computer was my only escape, my window to a world beyond the one I was trapped in. Without it, I felt like my lifeline had been cut. My mom blamed me for everything, even though I had never encouraged any kind of relationship with the boy. But in her eyes, I was guilty. I didn't cry that night, though. I had grown used to bottling up my emotions and letting my pain turn into numbness. Life went on like this for a while. I continued with my schoolwork, but my grades began to slip. With my computer destroyed, I couldn't draw as much anymore, which had been my passion. My parents noticed the drop in my academic performance, and the punishments became harsher. They accused me of being lazy and irresponsible. Every mistake was met with more beatings, more yelling, and more threats. My relationship with my brother grew colder. He started to follow my parents' lead, distancing himself from me and enjoying the privileges that I was denied. I couldn't even talk to him about my struggles because he always sided with our parents. When I reached high school, things took an even darker turn. I was constantly anxious, depressed, and isolated. My parents never noticed. To them, I was just an ungrateful daughter who wasn't living up to their expectations. I stopped eating regularly and lost a lot of weight, but they never asked why. I became invisible in my own home. only noticed when it was time to criticize me or find something I had done wrong. Despite all this, I found a small source of hope. I had a teacher in high school who seemed to care. She noticed that I was always sitting alone, never participating in group activities, and often staring off into space. One day, she approached me after class and asked if everything was okay. I hesitated at first, unsure if I should open up to her, but something in her gentle voice made me feel safe, so I told her a bit about my situation at home, without going into too many details. She listened, really listened, and didn't judge me. From that day on, she became a sort of mentor to me. She would check in with me regularly and encourage me to focus on my studies. She told me that education was my key to freedom. For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone believed in me. I began to pour my energy back into my schoolwork, trying to raise my grades again, not for my parents, but for myself. I realized that if I wanted to escape the life I was trapped in, I needed to succeed on my own terms. During my final year of high school, something unexpected happened. My family received a marriage proposal from a man in our community. He was much older than me, but he had a good reputation, a stable job, and came from a respected family. My parents immediately accepted the proposal without even asking me how I felt about it. They saw it as an opportunity to marry me off and get rid of what they considered a burden. I was devastated. I didn't want to marry this man. I barely knew him, and the idea of spending the rest of my life with someone I had no connection with terrified me. But in our culture, it was rare for a girl to have a say in her marriage, especially when her parents had already made up their minds. I was trapped once again, this time in a situation that felt even more permanent. I tried to talk to my mother about it, to explain how I felt, but she didn't listen. She told me that I should be grateful for the proposal and that many girls my age would be envious of my situation. She said that marrying this man would bring me stability and a good life, but I couldn't see it that way. All I saw was another prison, just like the one I had lived in for so many years. As the wedding preparations began, I felt like I was being dragged deeper into a dark hole, one I couldn't climb out of. I wanted to run away, to escape everything, but I had no resources, no one to turn to. The teacher who had once supported me had left the school, and I didn't have any close friends I could confide in. I was completely alone. Then one day, something inside me snapped. I decided I couldn't go through with the marriage. I had to find a way out, but I knew that defying my parents would come with severe consequences. I didn't know what those consequences would be, but I was ready to face them. Anything was better than living a life that wasn't mine. The night before the wedding, I packed a small bag with some clothes and a few personal items. I had saved a little bit of money from my art commissions, and I planned to use it to get as far away from home as possible. I didn't have a clear plan, but I knew I had to leave. As I stood by my bedroom window, looking out at the quiet night, I felt a mix of fear and excitement. For the first time in my life, I was about to take control of my own destiny. I waited until everyone in the house was asleep. My heart was racing as I tiptoed through the dark, silent halls. Every creak of the floorboards felt like an alarm going off, but no one stirred. I made it to the front door and paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. Then, without looking back, I opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. The moment I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but it also made me feel alive. It was as if I was breathing for the first time in years. I clutched my small bag tightly and started walking, my feet moving faster than my mind could process. I had no idea where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not yet. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound being the distant hum of cars and the occasional bark of a dog. As I walked through the dark streets, my thoughts were racing. I hadn't planned for this moment as well as I should have. What was I going to do once I reached the bus station? How far could I even go with the little money I had? My mind kept circling back to the same question. Where could I go to be safe? I was too afraid to stay in my city, knowing that my family would come looking for me as soon as they realized I was gone. I decided to head for the nearest bus station, hoping to catch the earliest bus out of town. When I finally arrived, my heart sank as I saw the station was mostly deserted, except for a couple of travelers sleeping on benches. The next bus wasn't scheduled for another few hours. I found a corner to sit in, trying to stay out of sight and hoping no one would recognize me. I knew that once my family discovered I was missing, they would come looking for me. The fear of being dragged back home, of being forced into a life I didn't want, kept me alert. Time passed painfully slowly. Every minute felt like an hour as I waited for the bus that would take me away from everything. My mind was filled with 1,000 what-ifs. What if they found me before I could leave? What if they punished me even more harshly for running away? What if I couldn't survive on my own? But despite the fear, I knew I couldn't go back. Not after making it this far. When the bus finally arrived, I quickly bought a ticket with the little money I had and boarded without hesitation. As I took a seat near the back, I let out a long, shaky breath. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was in control of my own fate. The bus rumbled to life, and as it pulled away from the station, I watched the city I had grown up in fade into the distance. I didn't know where I was going, but I was free, for now. The bus ride was long, and the sun was just beginning to rise when I reached the next town. Exhausted, I stepped off the bus and looked around. I had no idea where I was or what to do next. My first priority was finding a safe place to stay, at least for the day. I couldn't afford a hotel, so I wandered through the streets, trying to find a quiet corner where I could rest without drawing attention to myself. Eventually, I found a small park and sat down on a bench. The weight of everything that had happened in the last few hours began to crash down on me. My body was tired, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. I had left behind everything I had ever known, for better or worse, and the reality of my situation started to sink in. I was alone in an unfamiliar town with almost no money, no plan, and no one to turn to. But even in the midst of the fear and uncertainty, there was a part of me that felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. I had taken the first step toward building a life of my own, away from the suffocating control of my parents. I had no idea what the future held for me, but I knew that, for the first time in years, it would be my choice. After resting for a few hours, I knew I had to figure out what to do next. I couldn't stay in this town forever. I needed a plan, a way to support myself. I had always been good at art, and it had brought me small bits of joy and money in the past. Maybe I could use that talent to start over. I remembered a conversation I once had with my high school teacher. She had mentioned that there were organizations that helped young women in difficult situations. Maybe, just maybe, I could find one of those places and get the help I needed. With renewed determination, I got up from the bench and started walking again, this time with a clearer sense of purpose. I wandered the streets for a while, asking for directions to the nearest community center. After a few failed attempts, I finally found one. A small building with a worn-out sign that read, Women's Support Services. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle. Part of me wanted to turn around and leave, to disappear, and try to make it on my own. But I knew I couldn't do that. I was tired of running, tired of living in fear. I had taken the first step by leaving home, and now it was time to take another by asking for help. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The air was warm and smelled faintly of coffee. A kind-looking woman behind the desk greeted me with a soft smile. She asked me how she could help, and for the first time in my life, I told the truth. I told her everything, about my family, the abuse, the arranged marriage I had fled from. As the words spilled out, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders. She listened patiently, without judgment, and when I was finished, she placed a reassuring hand on mine. "You're safe here," she said gently. We can help you." And for the first time in years, I believed her. The woman behind the desk introduced herself as Margaret. She guided me to a small office, where she offered me a cup of tea. I accepted it, feeling a strange mix of relief and exhaustion washing over me. Margaret handed me a few pamphlets about local shelters, job training programs, and legal aid services, all designed to help women in situations like mine. As I looked through them, my mind was swirling with questions. Could I really rebuild my life from nothing? Would I ever truly be free from my family's reach? Margaret sat down across from me and spoke softly. "We're going to help you find a safe place to stay, and we'll work through everything one step at a time. It's okay to feel overwhelmed. It's normal after what you've been through." Her words were reassuring, but I still felt a knot of uncertainty in my chest. I had never relied on anyone before. I had always been the one to keep everything inside, to handle everything on my own. For the next hour, Margaret patiently explained my options. There was a women's shelter nearby where I could stay temporarily, and they could help me with getting a new ID and finding work. I could also speak with a counselor to start processing the trauma I had experienced. The idea of counseling scared me. Opening up about the past felt like tearing open a wound that had barely healed. But I knew I couldn't keep everything buried forever. As Margaret called the shelter to arrange my stay, I stared out the window. The sun was now fully up, and the world outside seemed so ordinary, so normal, as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed for me. I was no longer the girl who quietly followed the rules, who kept her head down and did what she was told. I was someone else now, someone stronger, even if I didn't feel it yet. Margaret walked me over to the shelter a few blocks away. It was a modest building, nothing fancy, but it looked clean and welcoming. As we approached, my stomach twisted with nerves. This was the place where I would begin again. The shelter staff greeted me warmly, and one of the women, a tall, kind-looking lady named Clara, showed me to my room. It was small but private, with a bed, a nightstand, and a window that let in the morning light. It wasn't much, but it was more than I had dared to hope for. After settling in, Clara sat with me and explained how things worked at the shelter. They provided meals, basic toiletries, and support groups for the women staying there. She encouraged me to attend the group sessions, but I wasn't sure I was ready for that. I wasn't sure I was ready to share my story with anyone else. Not yet. For the first few days, I kept mostly to myself. I spent my time in the small library they had, reading books and trying to plan my next move. The shelter offered job placement assistance, and I signed up for a few classes that could help me learn new skills. My art had always been my escape, but I knew it wouldn't be enough to survive on. I needed something more practical if I wanted to stand on my own. Every night, I lay in bed, thinking about my family. I wondered if they were looking for me. I wondered if they missed me, or if they were angry. The thought of them finding me filled me with dread. I had changed my phone number and left behind all traces of where I had been, but I still felt a lingering fear that they could track me down somehow. One evening, I sat in the common room, watching as some of the other women chatted and laughed quietly. Their laughter reminded me of how long it had been since I had felt truly happy, since I had laughed without a care in the world. One of the women, a girl around my age named Layla, noticed me sitting alone and walked over. "Hey," she said with a friendly smile. "Mind if I sit with you?" I hesitated for a moment but then nodded. She sat down beside me, her energy bright and warm. "I haven't seen you in any of the group meetings," she said, her tone casual but curious. "They really help, you know." "I'm not sure I'm ready for that," I replied softly. Layla nodded, as if she understood completely. "I get it. I wasn't ready at first either. It took me weeks to even talk to anyone. But once I did, I realized I wasn't alone. We've all been through something, and talking about it helps more than you'd think." I didn't say anything at first, unsure of how to respond. But Layla's presence was comforting, and for the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel so alone. We talked for a while longer, about light things, books we liked, music we missed listening to. For a brief moment, I felt normal again, like a girl just chatting with a friend, not someone carrying the weight of a painful past. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Layla's words. Maybe it was time to stop keeping everything inside. Maybe it was time to start healing, even if it hurt at first. The next morning, I made a decision. I would go to the group meeting. I would start opening up, piece by piece, and let myself believe that I deserved to heal, that I deserved a new life. As I walked into the meeting room, my heart pounded in my chest. The other women greeted me with warm smiles and welcoming nods. Margaret was there too, offering silent support. I took a seat and listened as the others spoke, sharing their stories, their pain, their hopes for the future. And when it was my turn, I took a deep breath and spoke. For the first time, I told my story out loud, not just to one person, but to a room full of women who understood. It was terrifying, but it was also freeing. With every word, the weight on my chest grew lighter, and when I was done, the room was silent for a moment before Layla smiled at me from across the circle. "Thank you for sharing," she said softly. In that moment, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to live. The group meeting had been a turning point, but it wasn't a miracle cure. Over the next few weeks, I found myself oscillating between hope and despair. Some days, I felt like I could conquer anything, and on others, I was plagued by self-doubt and fear. I continued attending the group meetings, and each time I felt a little stronger, a little more in control of my story. But there were still moments when I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, panicking that my past would catch up to me. One afternoon, I sat in the shelter's library, sketching aimlessly in my notebook. Drawing had always been my sanctuary, a way to express feelings I couldn't put into words. Today, my hand moved almost mechanically across the paper, creating abstract shapes that reflected the confusion swirling in my mind. As I worked, Clara approached me, a thoughtful expression on her face. "You're really talented," she said, glancing at my drawing. "Have you thought about using your art in your job search?" I blinked, surprised. "I don't think I could make a living with this." Clara smiled gently. "You'd be surprised. There are many ways to use art: graphic design, illustration, even teaching. You have a gift, and there are people who would pay for that. Maybe you just need to explore your options a bit." Her words stuck with me long after she left. I had always thought of my art as something personal, something that couldn't translate into a career. But maybe she was right. Maybe I could build something out of it. The thought made me feel both excited and terrified. I didn't want to set myself up for disappointment, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the idea that maybe this was my chance to follow a dream I had never let myself pursue. Over the next few days, I started researching. The shelter had computers, and I spent hours reading about different career paths in the arts. Graphic design seemed promising. It was creative but also practical, with steady demand. I found free online courses and signed up for a beginner class. It felt like a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. Meanwhile, Layla and I became closer. She had a magnetic energy, the kind that drew people in without even trying. She had been at the shelter longer than me, and she was well on her way to rebuilding her life. She had started a job at a nearby cafe and was saving up to get her own place. Her resilience inspired me, and our conversations became a source of comfort. One evening, after a particularly tough day, Layla found me in the common room, staring blankly at the TV. She sat beside me and nudged my arm. "Hey, you okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. I sighed. "I don't know. Some days it feels like I'm making progress, but other days I feel stuck, like I'll never really escape everything." Layla nodded, understanding all too well. It's a process. Healing isn't linear, you know? There are ups and downs, but you're moving forward, even when it doesn't feel like it. Look at you. You're taking classes, going to group. You're doing things you wouldn't have done before. That's progress. Her words gave me a small sense of comfort. I had been so focused on the big picture, on the idea of complete freedom, that I hadn't appreciated the small victories along the way. A few weeks later, I finished my first online course. It was a beginner's class in graphic design, and while I had a lot to learn, I felt a spark of excitement that I hadn't felt in a long time. I started building a portfolio of practice designs, hoping to use them to apply for entry-level freelance jobs. Around the same time, Margaret approached me with an opportunity. One of the local community centers is looking for someone to help teach an art class for kids, she said. It's only part-time, but I thought you might be interested. My initial reaction was fear. I had never taught before, and the idea of standing in front of a group of children, guiding them through something as personal as art, was intimidating. But Margaret was encouraging. You'd be great at it, she said, and it could be a good way to build your confidence. I hesitated for a few days before finally agreeing to give it a try. On the first day of the class, I was a bundle of nerves. The children, ranging in age from 6 to 12, were excited and full of energy, which only added to my anxiety. But as I started showing them simple drawing techniques, something shifted. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself relaxing, enjoying the process of teaching them. One little girl, Emily, tugged at my heart. She was quiet and shy, much like I had been at her age. But when she drew, there was a spark in her eyes, a sense of wonder that reminded me of myself. After class, she approached me, holding up her drawing, a simple but beautiful sketch of a tree. "Do you think I could be an artist one day?" she asked softly. My heart swelled at her question. "Absolutely," I said, smiling down at her. "You can be anything you want." The class became a weekly routine, and it gave me a sense of purpose that I hadn't felt in a long time. Teaching the children was a reminder of the power of art, not just as an escape, but as a way to connect, to inspire, to heal. As the weeks turned into months, my life began to take shape. I continued with my graphic design courses and even landed a few small freelance gigs. The money wasn't much, but it was a start. More importantly, I felt like I was building something real, something that was mine. One evening, after another successful art class, I sat in the shelter's small courtyard, looking up at the stars. Layla joined me, her expression thoughtful. "You've come a long way, you know," she said quietly. "I'm proud of you." I smiled, feeling a warmth in my chest. "Thanks. I still have a long way to go, though." "We all do," Layla said, her voice soft but steady. "But you're not the same person who walked into this place months ago. You're stronger now. You're living, not just surviving." As I sat there, under the night sky, I realized she was right. I had been through so much, but I had also come so far. I wasn't just the girl who had run away from her past. I was someone who was building a future. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful about what that future might hold. As the months passed, life continued to unfold in unexpected ways. My confidence grew, not just in my art, but in my ability to navigate the world again. I became more comfortable teaching the kids, and it quickly became the highlight of my week. The community center even offered me a small stipend, which, combined with my freelance gigs, allowed me to start saving money. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was regaining control over my life. One Friday evening, as I was packing up my materials after class, Margaret approached me with a serious expression on her face. "I've got some news," she said, folding her arms as she leaned against the doorframe. "The shelter is going to be offering a new transitional housing program. It's not permanent, but it's a step toward independence. You'd be one of the first to qualify if you're interested." I blinked, the words taking a moment to sink in. "Housing?" I asked, unsure if I had heard her correctly. Margaret nodded. "It's a small apartment, just enough for one person. Rent is income-based, and they help you find work or keep your current job. It's temporary, but it's a huge step forward." For a moment, I couldn't speak. The idea of having my own space, of not sharing a crowded room with strangers, was almost overwhelming. I had grown used to the shelter's walls, to its routine, but I had always known it was just a pit stop. The thought of moving out, of stepping into the world on my own again, was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I don't know what to say," I finally whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Say you'll think about it," Margaret replied with a smile. "You've earned this, and you deserve a place that's yours." That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to picture what it would be like to have a home again. A real home, not just a place to sleep. I had grown so used to feeling rootless that the idea of putting down even temporary roots seemed foreign. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was the next step. I couldn't stay at the shelter forever, and maybe, just maybe, I was ready. A few weeks later, I moved into the small apartment. It was nothing fancy, just a single room with a kitchenette and a tiny bathroom. But to me, it felt like a palace. The first night I slept there, I didn't even unpack. I just lay on the mattress, staring at the blank walls, trying to process the fact that this was my space, my own. The freedom felt strange at first. I had grown accustomed to the shelter's rules and schedules, to the constant noise and chatter of other residents. Now the silence of my apartment was almost unsettling. But slowly, I began to settle into a routine. I decorated the space with simple things: secondhand furniture, a few pieces of art, plants I picked up from the corner store. It wasn't much, but it was mine. Layla visited often, and we'd sit in my little living area, drinking tea and talking about our future plans. She was still at the cafe, saving up money for her own place. We talked about what it would be like when we both had our own homes, when we were fully independent. It felt like a dream, but one that was becoming more tangible by the day. The kids' art class continued, and I found myself pouring more of my heart into it. Emily, the shy little girl with the big dreams of becoming an artist, had blossomed over the months. Her drawings were becoming more confident, more expressive, and every week, she showed me something new she had created. One day, after class, she handed me a folded piece of paper. "I made this for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I unfolded the paper and found a sketch of me, sitting at the front of the class, surrounded by children, smiling. It wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in its simplicity. I felt tears prick at my eyes. "Emily, this is amazing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Thank you." She smiled shyly and ran off to join her friends, leaving me standing there, clutching the drawing. In that moment, I realized how far I had come, not just in terms of my circumstances, but in terms of who I was. I had gone from someone who was barely holding on to someone who was making a difference in the lives of others. And it felt good, really good. As the weeks turned into months, my graphic design work began to pick up. I landed a few more freelance jobs, and one client even recommended me to a small local company that needed help rebranding their website. The pay was better than anything I had earned before, and for the first time, I started to feel like I was truly building a career. One afternoon, while I was working on a new project, I received an email that stopped me in my tracks. It was from a small design agency that had seen my portfolio online. They were looking for a junior graphic designer and wanted to interview me for the position. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. An actual job. A real, full-time job. The interview was scheduled for the following week, and I spent every spare moment preparing. By the time the day of the interview arrived, I was a bundle of nerves. I had been freelancing for so long that the idea of working in an office, of being part of a team, felt foreign. But when I walked into the agency's small office, I was greeted by a warm, welcoming atmosphere. The interview went better than I could have hoped. The creative director, a woman named Jenna, was friendly and down to earth. She seemed genuinely interested in my work and in my story. At the end of the interview, she smiled and said, "I think you'd be a great fit here. We'll be in touch soon." A week later, I got the call. They offered me the job. I was stunned. It didn't feel real. After everything I had been through, after all the fear and uncertainty, I had landed a job that I was passionate about, a job that would allow me to use my skills, to grow, to build a future. The first few weeks at the new job felt like stepping into a different world. I was no longer just a freelancer bouncing between gigs. I was part of a team now. The office was small but filled with energy, creativity buzzing in every corner. I sat at my desk, surrounded by fellow designers, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I truly belonged. Jenna, the creative director, quickly became a mentor to me. She encouraged me to push my boundaries, to experiment with new styles, and to take on bigger projects. Under her guidance, I found myself growing not just as a designer, but as a person. She saw potential in me that I hadn't fully realized myself. "You're not just good," Jenna told me one afternoon during a brainstorming session. "You have a unique voice in your work. We need more of that." Hearing those words was like fuel to my fire. I threw myself into every project, spending hours fine-tuning details and playing with new ideas. The more I worked, the more confident I became. Slowly, the doubts that had followed me for years began to fade. But with success came new challenges. Balancing the demands of a full-time job with the freelance work I had grown accustomed to was tough. There were days when I stayed late at the office, only to come home and spend a few more hours working on personal projects. Sleep became a luxury, but I didn't care. I was doing what I loved. Layla, who had finally saved up enough to move into her own place, often called to check in on me. She could tell I was burning the candle at both ends. "Don't lose yourself in work," she warned me one night as we talked over the phone. "It's easy to forget why you started when you're caught up in the grind." I knew she was right, but it was hard to slow down. Every day felt like an opportunity I couldn't afford to miss. Still, I promised her I'd take some time for myself, and in the quiet moments, I found solace in art again. Not just the work I did for clients, but the kind of art that had once been my refuge. Paintings, sketches, and the personal pieces that no one else saw. One Saturday, I visited the local art gallery that I had stumbled into months earlier. The place had become a kind of sanctuary for me. I wandered through the halls, soaking in the creativity and inspiration from other artists. As I stood in front of a particularly striking painting, a landscape that seemed to capture the quiet beauty of a sunset, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was Margaret. She smiled warmly, looking as surprised as I was to see her there. "I didn't know you were an art lover," she said. "I didn't know you were either," I replied, smiling back. We spent the next hour walking through the gallery together, talking about art, life, and the changes we had both been through. Margaret told me about the new programs she was helping to organize at the shelter, and I shared stories from my new job. It felt good to talk to someone who had been there at the beginning, who had seen me at my lowest and now could see how far I had come. Before we parted ways, Margaret stopped me and said something that stayed with me long after. "You've come so far," she said, her voice full of pride. "But remember, it's okay to slow down sometimes. Life isn't just about how much you accomplish. It's about finding peace along the way." Those words echoed in my mind as I returned to my apartment that evening. I looked around at the space I had built for myself. My small, cozy home, filled with the little things that mattered to me. I realized that, in my drive to keep moving forward, I had almost forgotten to appreciate how far I had already come. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter. I didn't rush to check emails or dive into my work. Instead, I spent the day painting, something I hadn't done in months. I let the colors flow freely, not worrying about the end result, just enjoying the process. By the time I was finished, the canvas was filled with a vibrant, abstract swirl of colors, a reflection of the emotional journey I had been on. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was mine, and that was enough. Over the next few months, I found a better balance between work and life. I continued to pour my energy into my job, but I also made time for myself, whether it was through painting, visiting galleries, or simply taking a walk through the city. And as I found this balance, my work improved even more. I realized that the key to creativity wasn't constant hustle, but giving myself space to breathe, to think, to dream. One afternoon, Jenna called me into her office. She had a serious look on her face, and I wondered if I had made a mistake on a project. But instead, she handed me a piece of paper, a contract. "We're promoting you," she said with a smile. "You've earned it." I stared at the paper in disbelief. A promotion? I had only been with the company for a few months, but apparently my hard work had paid off. Jenna explained that I would be taking on more responsibility, leading my own design projects, and mentoring new team members. It was everything I had ever wanted, yet I felt a pang of hesitation. I thought about what Margaret had said, about finding peace along the way. I realized that while I was excited about this new opportunity, I didn't want to lose myself in the process. I wanted to continue growing, but not at the expense of my well-being. So, I accepted the promotion with gratitude, but I made a promise to myself. I would keep pursuing my dreams, but I would also take care of the person behind those dreams, because at the end of the day, the journey was just as important as the destination. The weeks that followed the promotion were a whirlwind of meetings, presentations, and new challenges. I found myself in unfamiliar territory, leading a team and managing larger projects than I had ever imagined. At first, the weight of responsibility felt heavy, but as I settled into my new role, I realized how much I had grown. The confidence that had once seemed so elusive now felt like a second skin. My team was a mix of seasoned designers and fresh talent, each with their own unique perspectives. Leading them wasn't just about assigning tasks. It was about inspiring them to see beyond the obvious, to push boundaries, and to find their own voice. Jenna had done that for me, and now it was my turn to pass that on. There was a moment during one of our brainstorming sessions that really stuck with me. We were working on a campaign for a major client, and the team was struggling to come up with a concept that felt fresh. I could see the frustration building in the room, the pressure to deliver something exceptional weighing on everyone. Instead of forcing ideas, I decided to take a different approach. "Let's step away from the brief for a moment," I said, standing up and motioning for everyone to follow me. I led them outside, where the city was alive with its usual chaos. Cars honking, people rushing, the hum of urban life. "Look around," I told them. "Inspiration is everywhere. It's in the way the light hits the buildings, the colors of the street art, the rhythm of the city. Don't think about what the client wants. Think about what this place makes you feel." At first, they looked at me like I was crazy, but after a few moments, something shifted. I saw them relax, their expressions softening as they began to absorb the world around them. When we returned to the office, the ideas flowed effortlessly. The final concept we presented to the client was unlike anything we had initially imagined: bold, vibrant, and full of life, just like the city that had inspired it. Moments like that reminded me why I had fallen in love with design in the first place. It wasn't just about creating something beautiful. It was about capturing a feeling, telling a story, and connecting with people on a deeper level. As time went on, I found myself becoming more comfortable in my new role. I wasn't just a designer anymore. I was a leader, a mentor, and someone who could help others find their path. It was a responsibility I took seriously, but it also brought me immense joy. Watching my team grow and seeing their ideas come to life was one of the most rewarding parts of my job. Outside of work, life continued to evolve in its own way. Layla and I still met up regularly, though her new job and apartment kept her busy. We had both grown so much since those early days, but our friendship remained a constant. We often joked that we had come a long way from sitting on that old couch, dreaming of a better life. One evening, as we sat in her new apartment, sipping tea and catching up, Layla looked at me thoughtfully. "Do you ever think about where you'd be if things hadn't worked out the way they did?" she asked. I paused, considering her question. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But I think we were always meant to find our way here, one way or another." Layla smiled. "Yeah, I guess you're right. It just feels surreal sometimes, doesn't it? How much can change in such a short time?" It did feel surreal. Just a year ago, I had been struggling to make ends meet, unsure of what the future held. Now, I had a career I loved, a supportive community, and a sense of purpose that had once seemed so far out of reach. But even with all the progress I had made, there were still moments of doubt, times when the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming, or when I wondered if I was truly on the right path. It was during those moments that I would think back to the people who had helped me along the way: Margaret, Jenna, and of course, Layla. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Margaret. She sounded excited, her voice filled with the kind of energy that told me something big was happening. "There's an opportunity I think you might be interested in," she said. "The shelter is hosting an art exhibition next month, and I'd love for you to be a part of it." An art exhibition? I hadn't done anything like that in years. My first instinct was to decline. I was too busy, I told myself, too focused on my career. But then I thought about the personal pieces I had been working on in my spare time, the ones that no one else had seen. "Tell me more," I said, my curiosity piqued. Margaret explained that the exhibition would feature works from local artists, with all proceeds going to support the shelter. It wasn't a huge event, but it was something close to her heart, and she believed my work would be a perfect fit. I hesitated for a moment, the familiar voice of doubt creeping in. Was I really good enough to showcase my art? But then I remembered what Margaret had always told me. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about expressing yourself, about sharing your story with the world. So I agreed. Over the next few weeks, I worked on a series of paintings that reflected the journey I had been on, the struggles, the growth, the moments of doubt, and the triumphs. Each piece was deeply personal, a reflection of the emotional landscape I had navigated over the past year. The night of the exhibition arrived, and as I walked into the gallery, I felt a mixture of excitement and nerves. My paintings hung on the walls, each one telling a different part of my story. I watched as people moved through the space, stopping to admire the work, and for the first time in a long while, I felt proud of what I had created. Not just the art, but the life I had built for myself. Margaret found me standing by one of my pieces, her face glowing with pride. "You did it," she said softly. "I always knew you would." I smiled, a sense of peace washing over me. For so long, I had been chasing something: success, validation, a sense of belonging. But standing there in that gallery, surrounded by the work that came from my heart, I realized that I had already found what I was looking for. I had found myself. As the night of the exhibition carried on, I found myself reflecting on how far I'd come. People mingled, sipping on wine, talking quietly as they viewed the art. Each piece on the wall represented a moment in my journey: pain, joy, doubt, and triumph all woven together in paint and brushstrokes. It was surreal to see it all laid out like that, as if the path I had walked was now something others could experience too. Margaret stayed by my side for a while, offering quiet support before mingling with other guests. I spotted a few familiar faces from the shelter, people who had seen me at my lowest point. I smiled as I noticed how much had changed. We were all evolving in our own ways, learning to carry our scars with a sense of pride rather than shame. Just as I was getting comfortable in the rhythm of the evening, I saw someone I wasn't expecting, Jenna. She entered the gallery with her usual confidence, her presence commanding attention. For a brief moment, panic rose in me. What would she think? Would she see me as the same inexperienced designer who once fumbled her way through projects? But when Jenna caught my eye, her expression softened, and she made her way toward me. "I didn't know you were an artist too," she said with a smile, gesturing to the paintings around us. I felt a surge of gratitude that she was there. "It's more of a passion project," I admitted, "something I've always done on the side." Jenna nodded, her eyes scanning the room. "You have a real gift for storytelling, you know. It shows in your work, both in the office and here. It's not just about design for you, it's about connecting with people." I hadn't expected such a compliment, especially from someone like her. For a long time, I had seen Jenna as this untouchable figure, someone who had it all figured out. But standing here, in this moment, I realized that maybe she had always seen something in me that I hadn't been able to see in myself. "Thank you," I said, feeling a sense of validation that was both humbling and empowering. Jenna smiled. "You're going to go far. I always knew that." Then, as if sensing the emotional weight of the moment, she added, "Keep doing what you're doing. You've got something special." As Jenna walked away, I felt a sense of closure. The woman who had once been my mentor had just given me the reassurance I didn't know I needed. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first met her, but her belief in me had remained constant. As the evening wore on, more people approached me to talk about my work. Some offered kind words, others shared stories of how certain pieces resonated with their own experiences. I realized then that art, like design, was about connection. It was about taking something deeply personal and turning it into something that could resonate with others, something that could make people feel seen. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin, I found myself standing in front of one particular painting, a piece that had taken me weeks to finish. It was a self-portrait, though not in the traditional sense. The image depicted a figure standing on a path, surrounded by a storm. But in the distance, there was light, a warm glow breaking through the clouds. It was a representation of my journey, the struggles, the moments of doubt, the feeling of being lost in the chaos of life. But it was also about hope, about finding my way through the storm and toward something brighter. I hadn't intended for anyone to linger on this piece for too long. It was too raw, too personal. But as I stood there, lost in thought, I heard a familiar voice behind me. "This one's my favorite," Layla said softly, stepping beside me. I turned to her, surprised. "You think so?" She nodded, her gaze fixed on the painting. "It's you. It's everything you've been through, everything you've overcome. It's powerful." I felt a lump form in my throat. "I wasn't sure if anyone would get it," I admitted. "It's so personal." Layla looked at me, her eyes full of understanding. "That's why it's beautiful. You've always been brave, even when you didn't see it. This piece? It's proof of that." Her words hit me harder than I expected. In that moment, I realized that this wasn't just a celebration of my art or my career. It was a celebration of everything I had become. The girl who once doubted herself had transformed into someone who could stand tall, even in the face of uncertainty. As the night came to a close, I helped Margaret and the team clean up the gallery. We packed away the paintings and said our goodbyes, but I left with something far more valuable than I had walked in with: a sense of peace, of pride, and of possibility. In the weeks that followed, life returned to its usual rhythm. I continued my work, balancing my career with my newfound love for painting. The exhibition had opened a new door for me, not just as an artist, but as someone who could create and express herself without fear of judgment. One afternoon, as I was sitting at my desk, a thought occurred to me. It wasn't about the next big project or the next milestone in my career. Instead, it was a simple realization. I was happy. Not just content, but truly happy. With my work, my relationships, and most importantly, with myself. And that, I realized, was the greatest achievement of all. As the weeks turned into months, life took on a new rhythm. My career continued to thrive, but I no longer measured success by external achievements alone. Instead, I found fulfillment in the little things, the quiet moments spent painting in the early hours of the morning, the conversations with friends who had become like family, and the simple joy of knowing that I had built a life that felt truly mine. One afternoon, as I sat at my desk sketching out a new design, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Margaret, with the subject line, "Exciting opportunity?" I opened it, my curiosity piqued. The message was brief, but it packed a punch. "A client I met at the exhibition was incredibly impressed with your work. They're opening a new gallery space in Paris and want to feature your paintings in their grand opening show next spring. If you're interested, let's discuss. This could be huge for you." Paris, the city of art, culture, and dreams. It felt surreal. Just a year ago, I had been struggling to find my footing, unsure of who I was or where I was going. And now, the possibility of exhibiting my work in one of the art capitals of the world was right in front of me. I leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the opportunity sink in. It was everything I had ever wanted. And yet, for the first time, I didn't feel the urgency to prove myself. I wasn't chasing success anymore. I was simply following my passion. And that made all the difference. I replied to Margaret, telling her I was definitely interested and that we could discuss the details soon. But before I hit send, I paused for a moment to reflect. The road ahead was still full of possibilities, but now I knew that I was ready for whatever came next. That evening, I decided to take a walk. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the fading light cast long shadows on the pavement. As I strolled through the city streets, I thought about how far I had come. I had started this journey unsure of myself, burdened by doubt and fear. But now, I felt a deep sense of peace. I passed by the little cafe where I had often met Layla for coffee, and I smiled at the memory of our long conversations about life, love, and everything in between. She had been my rock through it all, a constant reminder that I wasn't alone on this journey. As I continued walking, I found myself near the gallery where my exhibition had been held. The space was dark now, the windows empty, but I could still picture the night it had been filled with people, friends, mentors, and strangers, all coming together to celebrate something I had created. In that moment, I realized something profound. It wasn't about the destination. It never had been. The real beauty lay in the journey itself, the challenges, the setbacks, the moments of doubt, and the victories that followed. All of it had shaped me into the person I was now. I paused at the edge of the park, looking out at the city skyline. The lights twinkled in the distance, and I felt a sense of calm wash over me. I didn't know what the future held, but I was no longer afraid of it. For the first time in a long while, I was truly at peace. Spring came sooner than expected, and with it, the trip to Paris. As I stood in the gallery on opening night, surrounded by my paintings and the vibrant energy of the city, I couldn't help but marvel at how life had unfolded. The gallery was filled with art lovers, collectors, and curators, all eager to see the new exhibit. Margaret was by my side, as she had been from the very beginning. She squeezed my hand, her eyes filled with pride. "You've done it," she whispered. I smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that came from accomplishment alone. It was a smile born from the realization that I had already found what I was looking for, long before I ever stepped foot in Paris. As the night wore on, I took a moment to step outside and breathe in the cool Parisian air. The Eiffel Tower glittered in the distance, a symbol of dreams and possibilities. I closed my eyes, letting the sounds of the city wash over me, and in that quiet moment, I realized that the journey wasn't over. It never would be, but that was the beauty of it. There would always be new challenges, new adventures, and new opportunities to grow. But now, I was ready. I had found my voice. I had found my place. And I knew, deep down, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The end.